Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 10 of Book Musings. In this episode, I'll take a look at Stephen King's On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft. And yes, another Stephen King work, but this time around, we'll change things up a bit. He changes things up a bit, and rather than offering fiction or writing a novel or short story, we'll take a look at his nonfiction work. I think he has maybe one or two others, but this is the one that is most well known, was very highly reviewed. I came into it with a lot of anticipation, especially having just read his fiction. If you tuned into any of my previous episodes, mentioned how it kind of sparked an interest in writing fiction again for myself. So I was very eager to take a look at, again, this nonfiction piece by him on the very process of writing. So as I usually do, I'll mention a little bit about why it is, I already did, I guess, why it is I came to read this book, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what it's about. I won't give away too much, but this is a very unique book. That's one of the first things I'll mention. So I'll give you kind of a general overview of what's going on as best I can in the book. And then I will offer sort of my musings on it, if you will. I had quite a few thoughts on this one as I went through it. And then we'll conclude with the book musings grade. Will this work of Stephen King, if you've watched any of the previous episodes, with each subsequent read, with each subsequent episode, he earned a higher and higher grade. Will this work make the highly coveted Book Musings Hall of Fame and perhaps even the top shelf? We shall see. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the background, why it is, again, I came to read On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft by Stephen King. By the way, he wrote this, or I should say, he published, it ended up being published in 2000. So it's been about 21 years plus at this point. So it's been a while. I personally, so again, if you've watched any of the previous episodes, you know this, but I've been reading a lot of Stephen King lately. Read Duma Key, that was the subject of a previous episode, 11/22/63, Under the Dome, and then I just finished reading Carrie. So I've been reading a lot of his fiction, his novels, what he's most well known for. And I think I mentioned in the previous episode at the end, wanting to, if I'm going to keep reading King, wanting to go back to the beginning and just read him chronologically. And I've heard that, there's a lot of good to be gained from doing that because there's a lot of Easter eggs and stuff that builds in subsequent novels. It's referring back to previous ones. So anyway, read a lot of his stuff and knew that he had written this. I have like vague memories of maybe reading this a long, long time ago in high school. I even thought I had a copy of this somewhere, but I couldn't find it, so I had to get a new one. This is actually really, really new version. It contains an interview with his son, who goes by Joe Hill, that was released less than 2 years ago, actually. But anyway, so the last one I read before turning to this then was Carrie. And by the way, I decided I don't want to keep, this isn't a Stephen King channel, so I don't want to keep just doing episode after episode on all these Stephen King novels. So I decided against doing another Stephen King novel episode, but I did read Carrie. It was much different, I'll just say real quick, much different read than his usual huge tomes here. This was more, there's a lot going on in his typical novels, his usual novels, the much longer ones. This one, it's more, there's just one or two events, and it all revolves around kind of that. So it was an interesting read in that sense, and I don't know, real quick, whether I would grade it as highly as some of those other works that I read, if I was pushed to grade this. But I think for his first novel was pretty good. So again, Carrie, he's pretty well known for Carrie. It was turned into a movie starring, well, not starring, John Travolta didn't really play that big of a role in the movie, a young John Travolta. But he was in that movie. It was a pretty good movie. Just watched it recently. So it had kind of a unique feel, at least what I'm used to, I should say, with respect to the longer novels. And I will say, I think it was pretty good. It has like kind of I think what could be a realistic sort of horror scene. I won't go into it in too much detail in terms of a girl growing up. And being bullied and so on. The opening scene is horrific, and then the end scene, well, actually the middle kind of, and then the end is yeah, there's again sort of like two or three main events, if you will, and that's really what the novel then um, revolves around. But anyway, that's Carrie. Didn't want to say, devote a whole episode to it. Maybe, I'm not necessarily saying I won't ever do another episode on Stephen King. This one, though, however, had a completely different feel. I don't know that I won't, ever do another episode on a novel of his, but uh, definitely felt like I wanted to do an episode on this one, though, because there's so much going on in it, and I'll say more on that, obviously, as we proceed here. But it's not like his typical novels. And, if you want to feel for what Stephen King's novels are like, you go ahead and take a look at the previous 3 episodes, right, where I offer all kinds of reflections on his fiction. So, anyway, I mentioned Carrie the movie. Wanted to throw out there too that I've been, as I've been in the midst of this King fever, if you will, been watching a lot of the adaptations. So we went, the last time we were at the library, checked out a bunch of his movies, right, related to his works. Watched The Shining. So these are the ones I've watched already: The Shining, Stand by Me, Carrie, Misery, Under the Dome, It, Gerald's Game, Under the Dome, I should say. So I mentioned that in the previous episodes. I couldn't quite. I mean, I just couldn't keep going. And for me, time's precious, especially as you get older, and it's hard for me to sit through, video stuff, movies, TV. It's really has to be gripping for me. Um, and as opposed to a book, I can read. It's weird for me. I can read almost anything. And I can't remember the last book I didn't actually finish, maybe other than like a philosophical treatise, right? But videos are completely different. And so I will say, Under the Dome, I couldn't make it even through the first season. Um, I like the book. I guess it goes to, or unless maybe you didn't see the episode, but really like the book. So I like the book way more by implication then, right? I like the book way more than I like the TV series adaptation. But in general, though, I do like most of the adaptations that, I've seen. Stand By Me really stands out. That's a classic. The Shining. It was curious and interesting just having watched The Shining, and then, reading this where he talks about, so The Shining's about, this won't spoil too much, a writer. A lot of his works are about writers naturally. A writer who's an alcoholic and just kind of goes crazy. And a lot of that, come to find out, is true of Stephen King, other than maybe the going crazy part. He was a kind of, well, not so much a closet alcoholic, maybe at first a closet alcoholic, but eventually, they had to intervene. His wife had to throw an intervention. And that was actually one of the really interesting parts of the book, too. His hearing him, he's brutally honest. It's one of the things he champions. I'll reiterate that here as we proceed, but that's one of the things he champions is being brutally honest. That's a prerequisite for being a good storyteller, being a novelist, and he really is brutally honest. He doesn't hold back. He tells it exactly how it is, and a lot of the trials and tribulations he experienced as a result of his addictions to not only alcohol, as we'll see, but other drugs as well. So I think that's all I wanted to say in terms of background. I'll go ahead and mention, what the book is about, talk a little bit about that. And I mentioned this already. This book is very unique. It's, at least in my opinion, it doesn't seem to be doing necessarily one thing. He sets out to kind of tell us everything he knows about the craft, writing. And he certainly does a great job of that. But he does so much more than that, too. I mean, I don't know if it's the first half per se, but let's say the first third, maybe not quite even that, but the first good chunk is actually called CV. Maybe it is about the first third. It's called CV, and it's basically an autobiography, which is fascinating in its own right. So, one of the things I'll mention at the very end is, even if you're not necessarily into Stephen King's novels, or maybe you aren't an aspiring writer, it's still really interesting. That part's a really interesting read to hear him reflect on his own life, right? One of the most renowned storytellers, arguably of all time. It's an interesting read just to hear about his own life from his own perspective. And so that's what he does in the first, I don't know, third, let's say, of the book. But then he gets into the section on writing, where that's geared then to, it's like how should I put it, a treatise on, it's really like I like to get into the philosophical aspects, when I talk about novels and so on. And this is really like more or less, so this isn't a novel actually, but really it struck me as kind of like the philosophy of fiction. I mean, he really offers a survey of, everything related to the writing process. And that comes out then in that sort of, let's say the second of the three parts, major chunks. So the middle chunk of this book is him literally covering seemingly every facet of the writing process, revising paragraphs, grammar, style, so on and so forth. That's seemingly all covered in the middle part. And then the third part is like this sort of collection of this hodgepodge, if you will, of really interesting stuff as well. So part of it is like him post accident. So he wrote about, I think he said about half of it before his notorious accident, where he's run over by this driver who's weaving on this highway in Maine, weaving across the road, and he's taking a walk on a shoulder on the opposite side, and this guy runs him over. Traumatic accident. He talks all about that in here too. So the third part, it starts off with him giving this fascinating account of that and sort of how that affected everything, including the book itself, because he at that point of that accident he was about halfway through this, and so shortly thereafter he picks it up and finishes. But so then we get sort of his reflections on that very traumatic accident. They weren't sure he was going to make it, so we almost lost him, like 30 novels because of that. So then you get an interview with his son, which I think I mentioned earlier, which was less than 2 years ago. Took place less than two years ago. That was an interesting sort of read as well. He tacks on sort of reading lists. What have I been reading? All the works that not necessarily all of them, but like the key ones. He points out the key ones. Here's what I've been reading, and he updates it. So I think I mentioned, right, this is, I guess, the last version that's been printed, the most recent one, I should say. And every decade since, so there's 3 lists at the end, one for each decade since it's been originally published, of the things that he had read that previous decade that seemed to him significant. So that was interesting in itself, getting this like list of what he found to be profound or influential on himself in each of the prior decades. So anyway, there's a lot going on, if you can't tell already, in this fascinating book. And so one of the themes, I think I mentioned this earlier, that I'll suggest is that there's something on offer for almost everyone, I would say, in this book. Maybe it's not a book that the whole thing's going to appeal to you, but I would argue there's certainly chunks, at least, that will appeal to almost everyone. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, before I move on, I thought it was also interesting, a lot of what he interjects here is, not necessarily a lot, but he does this frequently, is like samples of his own like stuff, so he gets hands-on, offers a kind of glimpse into the actual sort of revising process in his own works. So which one was that in particular? He's offering samples from all kinds of different works, and sometimes he's offers samples that he made up for the purpose of the book itself. Sometimes he's drawing from excerpts of the novels that he's written, sometimes from the revising process. So I mentioned one in particular, I think it was from the one from the hotel room. Yeah, 1408. Excuse me. So you get him changing the title here. He talks about that. So that was an interesting sort of facet too, that just kind of how it gets really hands-on as well, and working with and offering a glimpse into his own process. And he does that a lot, actually, kind of telling you, and he's very clear, this isn't necessarily the hard and fast way to do it, but here's how I do it. And sometimes he does say, look, if you aren't willing to do such and such, then this gig isn't for you. For example, if you aren't into reading and writing, then becoming a novelist or becoming a writer is probably not for you. Obviously, if you're not into writing, it's probably not for you. But one of his points is, look, if you're not a voracious reader, if you're not into reading, that's one of his themes. Is that's one of the biggest ways you can become a better writer, is by becoming more and more familiar with your craft, i.e., by reading. And if that's not something that is of interest to you, then that is a kind of hard and fast thing. He says then you're going to have issues in this craft, this field of writing. So yeah, that's I guess kind of what I would say in terms of its overall what's going on in the book. And there's a lot of different things going on, a lot of interesting different things going on. So philosophically, I mentioned this is definitely a philosophical work, more so than his novels, and maybe that goes without saying. It is nonfiction, so obviously that's going to probably on the face of it come across as being more philosophical. But as I mentioned earlier, I really came away from this book feeling as if Stephen King had offered, philosophy of fiction, if you will. He covers, seemingly every aspect of the writing process, sections on everything he could think of, and he says this. I wanted to tell you. He says it somewhere, and I'll quote it here at some point. I want to tell you in what follows everything I know about the writing process, and he does that. So he covers the gamut, offers a nice survey of, like I said, everything there is associated with the writing process, and then he offers his takes on each of these various aspects. So it's one thing to kind of enumerate, well, you're going to have to revise and yada, 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 but then he goes in depth, and this is the part that I really appreciated, that made me appreciate the different aspects of Stephen King. He goes in depth and he analyzes these various aspects. So he doesn't just offer, again, like a survey, an overview of the various facets, but he dives into them and he gives you his philosophy of each of these various aspects. This is why, I focus on this and don't worry about this. And, this is why I think you need to write at least 2,000 words every day, and so on and so forth. So, more than anything, I'd say this book demonstrates to me that not only is he obviously an amazing storyteller, but he is a thinker, given the depth of the analysis. And then I'd also add that I have a newfound appreciation for Stephen King as a teacher. And I guess it kind of makes sense that he's a decent teacher because before he became a well-known writer, he taught English. But it's one thing to sort of have an appreciation for all these different aspects of the writing process. It's another thing to think about them and have a philosophy on all of them. But it's another thing entirely to be able to convey all of that stuff in a meaningful and appreciative way. And he does that as well. And to me, that's the mark of a good teacher, right? You can be a genius, but if none of it comes across to other people, you're not going to be a good teacher. That's not the case for Stephen King. Not only does he dive into all this stuff in great detail, he thinks about it. He's a thinker. He is able to convey his thoughts. And being a writer, I guess that maybe goes with the territory. Not necessarily, but he does it very well. He's able to convey his analysis in a convincing fashion oftentimes. Okay, so that's kind of what the book's about and what's going on philosophically, if you will. Now I'll run through some of my musings, some of my thoughts on the book, and I had quite a few of them. I thoroughly enjoyed, as I've intimated, all the parts of the book, but especially, the middle chunk for aspiring writers. I mean, I really like the CV part, the autobiography. I like the last part too, but the middle part, especially since, as I've mentioned, he kind of rekindled my own interest for writing fiction. I've dove back into this novel that I set aside for 15 years. Since I had kids, it's kind of been set aside. And he just, having read through these novels over the past month, his novels, he just sparked that interest again. I've been spending a lot of time, going back and picking that novel up on my own. And so, in view of that, then that middle chunk, especially, I really enjoyed. Again, I liked them all, but that was just so insightful. I like to think of myself, as a fairly smart dude, right? I'm studious. I read and write. And actually, a lot of what he says reminds me of myself in terms of when he talks about himself and some of his habits, and I'll mention that in a moment. But, I'm reflective and I think about a lot of stuff, and I still come away after reading this feeling like I've learned so much. And so, kudos to King on that account. Great, especially that middle chunk again. So he has sort of two main points he wants to say at one point. One is the advice we've all heard: avoid the passive voice. This is an example of one of the things I've appreciated about that chunk of the book. So he says two big pieces of advice or themes that I want to hammer home. Avoid the passive voice, right? But then the second one, I hadn't ever thought of, and that was adverbs, right? So you say, so and so says, blah blah blah, Joe said, and then what he says is, let's say you throw in sheepishly. Sorry about the handwriting there. That's an adverb, right? Stephen King does not like adverbs. So a second thing, big piece of advice, something I'd never thought of. And I've written 3 novels, again, on the 4th, written a doctoral thesis, and I'd never once heard this, reflected on this at all. But he says, look, adverbs are a bad sign. If you have a lot of adverbs tacked on in this sort of fashion, and I probably do if I go back through and read all my stuff, what it suggests is you're not confident that your writing has adequately conveyed, right, Joe's sort of demeanor at the time, right? That you don't think, unless you add this, you don't think it's going to have been adequately conveyed. And his point is, if you've done a good job already in setting like the setting up and provided adequate detail, if you've done all that sufficiently already, then this shouldn't be necessary. You should just be able to say, Joe said, and they should already know that Joe was doing so in a sheepish fashion. And there's something to that, I started thinking about that. Wow, there really seems to be something to that. If you do a good job of, again, setting up the scenario, and providing some context and so on, then again, we shouldn't have need for all those adverbs. And so again, a point that I had never really thought of, much less appreciated, and he points it out, puts it on my radar, and kind of made sense. I started thinking about it, and so I'm going to have that in the back of my mind now, probably for the rest of my life as I'm writing. So that's something that is due only and thanks to Stephen King. I wanted to, and so I did. If you've watched the previous episodes, you'll recall that I mentioned how I put the pencil away, right? I usually always have a pencil with me too when I'm carrying my books around and reading. But for his novels, I didn't do that. Well, for this thing, I'm marking this one up constantly throughout. I've got the pencil out for this, and so you'll get some quotes here. So along those lines on the adverbs, from page 128, he says, look, especially if you've been at it a while, in terms of these adverbs, you won't need them, okay? So this is page 128. Quote, and you probably have told your story well enough to believe that when you use he said, the reader will know how he said it, fast or slowly, happily or sadly. Okay, so look, you've probably done a good enough job, and you just don't realize it. Have some confidence. And so that's one of the overarching themes as well, is be more confident in your writing. If you've done a good job, you won't need those terrible adverbs. Right? And he admits, sometimes I have used adverbs, and when I do, it's because I'm not confident the reader will otherwise understand my meaning. So, he doesn't suggest that he never uses them, but pretty much every time we use them or he uses them, it's because, again, we feel like we're not confident that the reader would otherwise, understand that Joe was sheepish. Well, why is that? Maybe you need to go back and set the stage better. I appreciated that. So hopefully that made some sense. I really appreciated it. That's just one example of the kind of insight that he offers. Again, just one teeny tiny example in this book, especially that middle chunk, is just filled with those kinds of gems for aspiring writers. Another point I would say was it was interesting to hear him reflect. Again, he was brutally honest. Reflect on the process of writing a lot of these works. So again, I haven't read by any means, all of his works, and especially those earlier ones. And remember, this was written in 2000, and I think actually all the novels that I just read were post that. So, other than Carrie, I did go back and read that very first one. So a lot of the works that he's working with and reflecting on are the pre-2000 period, right? But it's still interesting to hear him again reflect on writing these various works. For example, Carrie, which I just finished reading prior to diving into this. He talks about the now infamous story, or at least I had heard of this story before reading the book, and that was how Carrie, that first novel, where'd she go? Right here. How initially when he wrote it, he wasn't happy with it and threw the first few pages away in the trash can. And he wakes up the next day, and his wife had dug them out of the trash can and set them on the table and said, "Look, I think there's something here. You need to keep working on this." And he's like, "Well, I don't know certain parts of it, right? Because I think I mentioned this earlier. It deals with girls growing up and puberty and so on, and the process that he as a male isn't that acquainted with." And she's like, "Look, I'll help you with that part. Don't give up on it. Keep it going." And so, thanks to his wife, who, by the way, that's another theme throughout this. He is just dotes on her throughout the work, which I found awesome as well. Just this, you don't see, I think, that kind of love demonstrated very often, and you know it's true love because she was there at the beginning when they had nothing, and it's been like what 40, 50 years. I don't know exactly how long they've been married, but through it all, and then including his dark years, which we'll get into here in a little bit. She sticks with him, and so on. So, but again, thanks to her, who she is, by the way, also a novelist, and their kids, who I'll get into in a little bit, are novelists as well. But she saved Carrie, so to speak. Tabitha King did, and so just one of the kind of interesting tidbits that he goes into. One of the tidbits I wasn't aware of that he talks about, writing The Stand. He talks about how he almost ditched that one as well. He talks about The Stand, writing The Stand, when he's talking about writer's block, right? When writers suddenly can't find anything to write about, right? There's a dearth of attractive ideas, or however you want to put it, right? And so he talked about how one of the few times, he doesn't get it often, one of the few times he had writer's block was with respect to The Stand, and he almost ditched it. So again, that was one of the ones I wasn't familiar with. And so that was really interesting, hearing him talk about how he went on these long walks and how he finally manages to sort of see his way out and save The Stand. But at one point, it was almost in the trash can as well. This is from page 203. He writes, this is regarding The Stand, quote, "If I'd had 200 or even 300 pages of single-spaced manuscript instead of more than 500, I think I would have abandoned The Stand and gone on to something else." So The Stand was almost lost as well, but he felt like he was too invested. Tabitha, his wife, didn't save it this time. Instead, his prior investment of time. He had invested too much time to abandon it at that point, he felt like. I mentioned one of the themes is you've got to be honest as a writer, and so he preaches this honesty. Writers have to be honest, tell it how it is. Don't worry about stepping on anyone's toes, saying things that might be offensive to a certain crowd. Again, you have to tell it how it is and be honest in all regards, he says. Otherwise, your readers aren't going to take you seriously, and it's not going to be as convincing. So that's one of the huge main themes that he develops throughout. So I wanted to offer a few quotes in evidence of that. So he says, this is from page 158. "Here comes the big question." It's the quote, "What are you going to write about?" And the equally big answer, "Anything you damn well want. Anything at all, as long as you tell the truth." 173 then, he writes, "Honesty in storytelling makes up for a great many stylistic faults, as the work of wooden prose writers like Theodore Dreiser and Ayn Rand shows. But lying is the great unrepairable fault." That was 173. 185. Quote, "As with all other aspects of fiction, the key to writing good dialogue is honesty. And if you are honest about the words coming out of your characters' mouths, you'll find that you've let yourself in for a fair amount of criticism. Not a week goes by that I don't receive at least one pissed off letter. Most weeks there are more. accusing me of being foul-mouthed, bigoted, homophobic, murderous, frivolous, or downright psychopathic, end quote. And he says, look, if you're going to be honest, some people are going to be offended. But that's the price you have to pay to be a good writer, because otherwise no one's going to find you, or very few people will find you convincing, right? Because you're being fake. 186, one last quote to this end. Quote, you must tell the truth if your dialogue is to have the resonance and realism that Hart's War, good story though it is, so sadly lacks. And that holds true all the way down to what folks say when they hit their thumb with the hammer. If you substitute oh sugar for oh shit because you're thinking about the Legion of Decency, you are breaking the unspoken contract that exists between writer and reader. Your promise to express the truth of how people act and talk through the medium of a made-up story. You have to tell it like it is. Don't worry about anybody that might get offended in the process. At least that's his opinion or philosophy. And I don't know, given how successful he's been, I think we ought to lend some credence to that. And so going along with this theme then of honesty, he not only does he try to be honest in his novels and his fiction, but then even in this work, I mentioned how brutally honest he is. And one example is the issues he faced associated with his addictions to drugs and alcohol, which I guess is pretty well known at this point. I didn't know that much about it, or at least the depth of it, until going through this and really hearing the firsthand account from him. But I guess most people people that are familiar with a lot of his works, at least, know or knew that he had experienced this particularly rough patch of his life. But it was really interesting, and kudos to him to be willing to again be so forthright. It was interesting to hear, from his own perspective, how that process went, how difficult it was, and he doesn't hold anything back. So along those lines, I didn't realize how deep he was in his issues. So he said, this is page 93, when he starts in that autobiography to kind of get into some of his issues then with alcohol when it first started to seep into his life. Quote, I'd been drunk the night before, but was only moderately hungover, which was good. One wouldn't want to be too hungover at the deathbed of one's mother. And actually, this is a little bit further into his life, where after he'd already tasted alcohol for the first time and so on. So he's talking about how his mom's not doing well, and again, she's on her deathbed, and he's kind of nervous about having had too much, possibly. And at least at that point, he wasn't too drunk. But then he talks about how, he's given the eulogy. This actually really, none of this is funny. This is page 94. He says, quote, I gave the eulogy. I think I did a pretty good job considering how drunk I was, end quote. Page 95. And so remember, he's writing this in the year 2000. It's been, quote, it's been almost 12 years since I took a drink. So you do the math, you go back. So, and I didn't go and look into this, but I presume he hasn't touched alcohol since he wrote this book either. I don't know that, but so at least as of writing this, he'd been sober from 1988 to then 2000. Okay, so it's interesting then, because there is, and you hear, King fanatics, various King fanatics have philosophies and opinions regarding, his drunk stage or era, or drugs stage and era versus post, addiction era and so on. Did he, which was better? Did he, did his writing get worse or better and so on? There's various opinions on that, but one thing I found kind of interesting in general is that he does continue to be productive during that addictive phase, but then also post-addictive phase. And actually, at one point, I don't think I put this in my notes anywhere, but he talks about how it is one of the biggest myths that you need to be inebriated or be somehow under the influence to have kind of creative inspiration. He says, no, that's not really true at all. And he's documented it through his own experience. So it's been almost 12 years since I took a drink. So again, 1980, that would by implication mean that his last drink was in 1988. Page 96, next page. So he's still going back and kind of reflecting. By 1985, I had added drug addiction to my alcohol problem. So here he's actually talking about not only was an alcoholic, and he says he talks about how he realized, again, going way back to The Shining, which was his third novel. I think the year 1975 sticks out for some reason. Yeah, he points it out. As early as 1975, he realized he was an alcoholic, and he didn't stop until 1988. So he went on, kind of knowing in the back of his mind he was an alcoholic for 13 years. I think that's interesting in itself. Excuse me. But then he talks about how he starts adding, 10 years into his alcohol addiction. So 1985, he throws some other drug addiction into the mix. So again, by 1985, I had added drug addiction to my alcohol problem. I knew I was an alcoholic as early as 1975. And then he writes, I wrote the Tommyknockers, often working until midnight, with my heart running at 130 beats a minute and cotton swabs stuck up my nose to stem the coke-induced bleeding. So he has a cocaine addiction as well at this point. Then he talks about how his wife has to step in then. They have an intervention. She dumps all this stuff out. There was like the trash in his office. It's just all kinds of different drug paraphernalia, and it wasn't good. And he kind of realizes at this point, okay, I need to make a change here. And then I'll cap it off with this quote. This is from page 99. At the end of my adventures, I was drinking a case of 16-ounce tall boys a night. And there's one novel, Cujo, that I barely remember writing at all. Unquote. He says, hey, that was actually a good book. I like that book. I just wish I could remember the experience of writing it. Because usually he talks about how that's an enjoyable process, and he just doesn't have any recollection of it. All kinds of little tidbits, like I said. At one point, he goes into I really like this, his analysis of categories of writers, and he talks about how there's this triangle. I don't know how much you can see here. Maybe we'll get rid of King for a second. We have a triangle, and at the bottom, where most people are, we have bad. Most people are bad writers, unfortunately. And unfortunately, I probably have to agree with him, reading a lot of writing for my profession. Then we have what he calls competent writers, less of those. Okay? And then we have good. Okay? Even fewer of those, very few of those. At the very top, we have great or genius writers, and there's very, 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 very few. At one point he mentions, oh, here they are, Shakespeare's, Faulkner's, Yeats, Shaw's, Eudora Wells, and so on. Those are some of the examples he throws out for these geniuses. And so he offers an analysis of the quality of writers in general. And one of his points, so I'll go ahead and then read this, really interesting is, he says, I have two theses. One's kind of inconsequential for the point here, but the second one is the one we want to latch on. So he says, this is from page 142, quote, I'm approaching the heart of this book with two theses, both simple. The first is that good writing consists of mastering the fundamentals, vocabulary, grammar, the elements of style, and then filling the third level of your toolbox with the right instruments. And that's an analogy he kind of builds on, what's in your toolbox. I'm not going to get too much into that here, though. The second is that while it is impossible to make a competent writer out of a bad writer, so these guys are just SOL. And that's one of the things, that's a hard and fast rule. He says, if you don't have grammar, there's not much I can do for you. I can tell you everything there is about the writing process and being a novelist. If you don't have a grasp of grammar, it's kind of similar, I think he says, to a musician. Some of them just have the pitch, or they can recognize keys and so on, and some don't. Right? If you don't have that feel for grammar, there's really nothing I can do for you. And so similar, he's saying, look, for most of us, there's not a lot I can do. There's not much we can do to turn the majority of us who are bad writers into competent writers. We're just SOL. I don't know. Is he right about that? We could debate that, but that's his thesis at least. So again, the second is that while it is impossible to make a competent writer out of a bad writer, and while it is equally impossible to make a great writer out of a good one, so we can't go here either. We can't go here and we can't go here. He says, this thesis says, what we can do is go here. we can turn competent, average writers into good writers. Okay, so again, let me read that all out. The second is that while it is impossible to make a competent writer out of a bad writer, and while it is equally impossible to make a great writer out of a good one, or a genius writer out of a good one, it is possible with lots of hard work, dedication, and timely help to make a good writer out of a merely competent one. Okay, so I found that really interesting. Again, just all kinds of little tidbits like this throughout. Really interesting stuff. Just all evidence of how much thought he really did put into this book. Another, especially as a writer, interesting thing for me, and here it was interesting, especially interesting because I am really at odds with King on this, and I think he would concede that this is just maybe it comes down to personal preference, but he would argue, and he does, that go with his side as a fledgling beginning writer. At least he makes points for why he takes his side on this. So what is the point or the issue? Plotting, outlining, planning ahead. King is very much against that in general. He says, you start with like a story, kind of a situation in mind, an idea, right? And just go with it. Don't sit down and try to like map out, chapter by chapter, scene by scene, what's going to happen, because he says it's going to feel stiff and arbitrary and artificial if you do so. And I can see that, definitely see that perspective. But it's interesting to me though, because as time has gone on in my life, I've become more and more and more of an outliner, of a planner, of a plotter in terms of my stories, my novels, right? I do like to, not only is this true of my philosophy and my nonfiction stuff, right? I definitely want to map out where my, the arguments are going and so on, but it's also true in, my novels. This last one that I picked up, right? I'm literally going through and outlining everything, like a very comprehensive outline. So I'm at the very other end of the extreme in terms of on this issue than King. King says start off with this general story and go with it, let it flow. And I can appreciate that perspective and what's the word, that approach. But for me, I work better, I feel like, if I know kind of what's happening and then I can write to that kind of. Otherwise, I'll just kind of sit there and idly at times too much, I feel like. So it was really interesting though to hear him, who obviously a prolific writer who has massive books, right, that are very long. You'd think that there was a lot of planning going on, and that you had this plot, all these plot lines, masterfully sort of plotted out beforehand. But no, or thought about these beforehand. But oftentimes, no. He says a lot of times it's organic. I don't know where it's going to end up. So that was really interesting to me. So some quotes from him along those lines. Page 164 we'll start with. Quote, plot is, I think, the good writer's last resort, and the dullard's first choice. The story which results from it is apt to feel artificial and labored. Okay, so again, that idea that if you plan too much of it out, it's going to feel artificial. Again, like too forced. If you're maybe trying to fit a script too much. Again, a point I can appreciate. Pages 168 to 169, then he writes, this was with respect to misery. So it was awesome. So I mentioned how he's constantly bringing up these works and to make his points in various ways. So he's talking about misery and how it proceeded in a very organic fashion. And in fact, how it originally wasn't going to end the way it ends up ending. So I thought that was interesting too, hearing him talk about how it originally had an alternate ending, by the way. So he writes, this is from page 168 to 169, quote, none of the story's details and incidents proceeded from plot. They were organic, each arising naturally from the initial situation, each an uncovered part of the fossil. And that's another analogy he uses, right? We're just, as novelists, as writers, he makes this this claim, where he argues that stories kind of make themselves. And he says, I really mean this. There's kind of some kind of magic involved, right? And that our job as writers is just to sort of see the story and then tell it as honestly as we can. And so none of that involves like sort of meticulously plotting everything out, at least in his opinion, right? It's just organically, spontaneously sort of writing the story as we see it revealed. Again, kind of a fascinating take. I'm not sure that doesn't fit me, right? How I work. But interestingly, that's how it works for him. So really interesting, again, tidbit there on whether or how much to plot things out. He says he would argue, right? Or he argues, don't do it too much, if at all. I mentioned earlier how a lot of what he was saying, reminded me of myself, and we do seem kind of similar in a lot of veins, and especially, I'm the only one I know that carries around a book almost everywhere I go, again, with the pencil usually in it, and he talks about how he does precisely that. So where was it? 147 to 148, for example, he writes, so again, mentioning how reading and writing, those things are the number one, right? You have to read and write. If you want to be a writer, you have to read and write. That's the first thing he starts off, the section I'm writing with is that's the number one thing. You have to read and write constantly. I think he even says like 6 hours a day. And by the way, I'm like probably the only one I know who reads and writes for 6 hours a day. I'm not tooting my own horn, just saying that, how much what he's saying and sort of how he describes his own life resonates with me, and how I don't see it oftentimes with too many others. So he talks again about how he carries a book around everywhere. He writes, quote, this is from 147, reading is the creative center of a writer's life. I take a book with me everywhere I go and find there are all sorts of opportunities to dip in. The trick is to teach yourself to read in small sips as well as in long swallows. Waiting rooms were made for books, of course, but so are theater lobbies before the show, long and boring checkout lines, and everyone's favorite, the John, of course. And again, I mentioned this in previous episodes, when I have to go pick up my kids, bring a book. When I go to various events, I'll take a book. So totally on board with what he's saying there. 293 speaks to this again. This is right before he offers one of his reading lists. What decade was this? I think this is the most recent one. So the books, right before he lists the books the most significant books he read between 2010 and 2019, he writes this. This is from page 293. Quote, I take a book with me almost everywhere. Books are the perfect entertainment. No commercials, no batteries, hours lost in other worlds. Why, I wonder, doesn't everybody carry a book around? Amen. I agree with you, Stephen. So, again, it just really resonated with me because I can't even tell you the last time I saw someone else out, let's say at a soccer game, we go to my kid's soccer game, who had a book. I don't remember the last time I saw a book. And so I really appreciated hearing that, I'm not the only one anymore that's carrying around books everywhere. Another thing that kind of reminded me of myself and that I appreciated was the degree to which he's anti-television. That came out here. So, I had it here somewhere. Right here it is. I mentioned how I read this book. It's been a couple months now, and I was going to do an episode on this, but there's just too much going on, and I'm going to do a mini course or something on it. And so, this is fresh on my mind. Read it in the last couple months, as I mentioned, and then to hear Stephen King then railing against TV as well was, again, something I appreciated. So, along those lines, he writes. This is from page 34 when he's offering his, autobiography. Quote, TV came relatively late to the King household, and I'm glad. I am, when you stop to think of it, a member of a fairly select group, the final handful of American novelists who learned to read and write before they learned to eat a daily helping of video bullshit. End quote. And he's probably right about that. 148. And so he's talking about how, again, how you should be, if you want to be a good writer, you got to read, okay? And how you can find ways to read, throughout your day, and there are ample opportunities, including he's talking about them as you work out. And he writes this then, TV, while working out or anywhere else, really is about the last thing an aspiring writer needs. If you feel you must have the news analyst blowhards on CNN while you exercise, or the stock market blowhards on MSNBC, or the sports blowhards on ESPN, it's time for you to question how serious you really are about becoming a writer. You must be prepared to do some serious turning inward toward the life of the imagination. And that means, I'm afraid, that Geraldo, Keith Olbermann, and Jay Leno must go. Reading takes time, and the glass takes too much of it. Right? Television takes too much of it. Once weaned from the ephemeral craving for TV, most people will find they enjoy the time they spend reading. I'd like to suggest that turning off that endlessly quacking box is apt to improve your quality of life as well as the quality of your writing, end quote. So one of the big things he says you could do if you want to be a good writer is stop watching TV. Okay, not only if you want to be a good writer, he says, but if you want to live a higher quality life. And that was precisely what Jerry Mander argues, and precisely what I'm starting to think more and more as I get older myself. Almost done with my musings here. I would also mention I thought it was interesting. So he reflects on writing various works. Well, he also reflects on writing this book itself, which, contrary to a couple others, including The Stand, as I mentioned, with the exception of this and a couple others, his experience of writing this and those couple others was contrary to, I don't know that I'm making this point very well, but contrary to the bulk of what he's written, in the sense that the bulk of what he's written has come fairly easily. He's talked about how, regardless of how long the book is, most of his stuff, most of his books, he's written in 3 months. And so there's been, again, 2 or 3 exceptions that I can think of. Again, the Stand, Carrie, he tossed aside, but I don't know that he necessarily took a huge break from that. So really 2 where he took kind of big breaks. I think The Stand was one of them, and then again, On Writing itself was one where he just set it aside for a year and a half. Actually, he writes at one point because it was so, for whatever reason, very, very difficult for him to. He describes it, I think, as very tedious for him. It didn't come as easily as writing the fiction. So I found that interesting. Page 248, he talks about that. Of course, when he says it's difficult, it takes him 3 years. Well, how many of us have written a book in 30 years, much less 3 years, right? But so relatively speaking, these were difficult for him to write, I should say. So he writes on 248, quote, I must tell you, though, that confidence during the actual writing of this book was a commodity in remarkably short supply. I found the act of, this is a little bit later, or lower down on the page, I found the act of articulating those instinctive truths painfully difficult. Also, something happened halfway through the writing of On Writing, a life changer, as they say, and of course that's his accident where he gets run over. Page 265, he again reflects on the difficulty of writing this book. Quote, I actually began On Writing in November or December of 1997, and although it usually takes me only 3 months to finish the first draft of a book, this one was still only half completed 18 months later. That was because I put it aside in February or March of 1998. So at the 3-month mark, he just sets it aside. Not sure how to continue or if I should continue at all. Writing fiction was almost as much fun as it had ever been, but every word of the nonfiction book was a kind of torture. It was the first book I had put aside uncompleted since The Stand, and On Writing spent a lot longer in the desk drawer. In June of 1999, I decided to spend the summer finishing the damn writing book. And June 19th, I believe, is when he gets run over. So he gets run over, and he's like, okay. So he kind of recovers out after a week and a half of that, and he's like, I'm gonna tackle this, and I'm gonna finish it. So yeah, interesting hearing him kind of again reflect on the writing process of the very book you're reading, right? And how for him it was arduous and difficult. The last thing I'd mention, I guess, before kind of offering my book musings grade, is just that I appreciated the tone, his personal tone throughout. He writes it as if he's, a really good friend of yours, like he really cares, or like your father, a father figure, like he really cares. It's not, a money grab, and of course he doesn't need to do anything for money at this point. At one point actually he does talk about, a question I get, is it for the money? And he says, of course not. He was doing this when he wasn't making anything. He's still doing it now when he doesn't need to, like I said, write anything. He's set financially. So it's never been about the money, and it was just really, I appreciated again how personable it was. He doesn't hold anything back, and he's very revealing in again his own writing process. And he doesn't hide secrets. He's not secretive about his success or how he got there. I really do find that appreciative, something I appreciate, and that's not something, it wasn't a cash grab, obviously, for him. Again, he writes it as if he really does genuinely care about the success of you, constant reader, you, dear reader, an aspiring writer. He wants his readers to succeed. At least that's, again, kind of how I felt throughout the book. I mentioned this earlier, right? He just will conclude with this. He said, right, that what's his aim in writing this? Of course, he says this halfway through the book on writing. So it was after the autobiography. I just find it funny that you're getting sort of his goal for the book about halfway through the book. So, quote, "What follows is everything I know about how to write good fiction," end quote, page 144. And that is precisely what he offers. Again, in a very personable fashion, like he's your dad saying, "Son, here's what you got to do. Buckle up. This is what you got to do. You got to find your time in that morning, every morning. It's got to be like become, like a habit. It's got to be ingrained in you, like a habit. You have to start writing, 2,000 words every day. Make yourself doing it until it becomes a habit, right? You have to read and write for 6 hours a day until it becomes easy, right? It's something you don't think about." And he tells you this in a very caring fashion, as if at least like he really does want you to succeed. So I guess I'll wrap up the musings with that. Okay, so moving on, what do I give on writing a memoir of the craft by Stephen King? By the way, let's put his last name back up here. And we'll give him a grade here in a moment. So let's give you the last name, Stephen King there. I've suggested this before. It should be pretty clear at this point. Really like the book. Suggested this before that I think that maybe not the entire book is for everyone, but there is something in this book, I would argue, for almost everybody. Whether it be, again, that really engaging, interesting account of his own childhood and becoming a writer, and really his whole life, right? His story of his life, at least up to the year 2000. Whether it be that and just hearing an account of one of the best storytellers of all time, or whether it be, you're an aspiring writer and, hearing about what he thinks you need to put in your writing toolbox to become a good writer, the kind of habits you need to establish, right? Whether it's that or whether you're just a diehard Stephen King fan and you get into then like the interviews and stuff that come at the end, or his reflections on his, terrible accident and how that affected his life. There is something in here, again, I would argue, seemingly for everyone. Okay, especially if you like Stephen King, especially if you are an aspiring writer. I mean, honestly, I can't remember reading anything, and I don't know the last time I read books along these lines, for people who want to become good writers. But I can't remember anything in recent years, at least, that's been nearly as influential in terms of becoming a good writer as reading, this work was. I mean, there is a lot of really, really valuable stuff, really good tips in here. Very invaluable, I'd say. If you want to be, again, if you're an aspiring writer, I think this would be the number one recommendation as far as, at least if I recall, right, things that I can recall, let's put it that way. This would be the number one book I'd recommend. If you're a Stephen King fan, there's stuff, again, in here for you as well. If you're a Stephen King fan and an aspiring writer, well, there's no better book out there, I'd say, right? This is it here, right here. So obviously have a lot of love for this book. It came at the right time too, again, having that interest of mine rekindled in writing my own novels. This, again, came at the perfect time, and it offered a lot of fruit for thought and things that I will be working into my own writing styles, my own writing habits. I'm not going to necessarily stop outlining, right, and sort of plotting ahead and what's going to happen in subsequent chapters. I'm not going to necessarily stop doing that just because Stephen King doesn't do that. But there's a lot of stuff that I definitely will take away from this book and appreciate. So without further ado, what do I give On writing, well, I have to give it an A. It has to reach the Book Musings Hall of Fame. It was that influential, I would say, for me. So, yeah. Now, not quite the top shelf, right? But it was close. Um, Definitely, I mean, a solid A. If you are, again, an aspiring writer, get to this book right now. Read it right now. Um, again, there's really no one I wouldn't recommend at least reading parts of the book to. So let's go ahead and set that aside. Great book. Oh, by the way, I brought back some. Where did I put them? Somewhere here I had oh yeah, the other members of the Book Musings Hall of Fame so far. So we have Animal Farm. Also, George Orwell's 1984 made it in, but I couldn't find that anywhere. So we still have him represented. He had two selections, Animal Farm and 1984, that made it. Harry Brown's How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World also made it. And now we have a new entrant, Stephen King's On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft. Very, very good book. Wanted to end, as I usually do, by talking a little bit about what might be on tap here. So I have so many props this time. Um, I mentioned this book in previous episodes that it's probably on tap, and lo and behold, indeed, I am on chapter 3. So this is what I'm currently reading right now. If I move on to read another Stephen King book, Salem's Lot would be up next because it was his second book. So I might turn to that. I might take a break from Stephen, though, for a while to move on to his son, maybe. No, I don't know actually what I'm going to read. When I read fiction next, I don't know necessarily what I'm going to read. I'm reading this one right now, and what comes after that, who knows? Maybe it'll be Salem's Lot, like I said, or maybe it'll be, I mentioned this, kids. So Joe Hill is actually a really well-respected author in his own right, and he wrote with the pseudonym to see if he could establish sort of, how do I want to put it? Sort of establish that he's a good writer without needing recourse to that name, right? Being Stephen King's son, right? He wanted to establish that in and of itself his writing was good, and he does that. And he's actually a graphic. He has some really critically acclaimed graphic novels. Lock and Key, I think it is. I don't know anything about his stuff. I just picked this stuff up here, but I really, I appreciate his move to try to find out whether he's got any talent himself and trying not to rely on his dad. Which I can't remember if I mentioned this in the previous any of the previous episodes, but King famously writes under an alias, Richard Bachman, for in his early in his career. He wrote, I think, 4 at least different books under this pseudonym, Richard Bachman, until someone finally pieced it together that it was Stephen King. And from what I read somewhere, the impetus for that, which I really liked, was King wanting to sort of be able to demonstrate to himself that he really had it, that it wasn't, so from his subsequent novels, right, after he'd become well known, having written, his first works, The Shining, so these are the first 2, and then The Shining is the third one. He's like, okay, he was a little bit unsure, is it now just my name that's selling these books, or is it the writing itself? And so to sort of convince himself of that, right, he starts writing under this alias, and Richard Bachman becomes popular at the time, people not knowing that it was Stephen King. So he what he set out to prove, he sort of ends up doing, right, and is able to kind of confirm that, okay, I've got something here. My writing is pretty good. And like I said, unfortunately, I don't think he wanted it to come out that he was Richard Bachman, but somebody pieced it together at some point. Okay, so mentioned again both his sons. So Owen King, his youngest son, writes under his own name, Owen King. He also writes, and I think he's written something jointly with Stephen King. But both of his boys write, and he has a daughter, I think, named Naomi. I don't know if she writes. I haven't heard of anything that she's written, but the sons have inherited the love for writing, and they seem to be, pretty well respected, at least, especially Joe Hill. And they both show up at the end of this. Actually, Owen writes a little short essay that was originally published in the New Yorker on June 16th of 2018. So I thought that was a good piece too. But so both of the sons are writers as well. I mentioned memory books, definitely still on the agenda for me, getting into why my memory is so bad, and maybe trying to improve it if I can. Philip K. Dick is another person who's on my radar. So I've acquired a few of his books here, including this last time I went to a bookstore, found this one, The Minority Report, in a really weird format. I've never seen a book like this, so I don't even know if I just have to get whatever I can find of Philip K. Dick. I didn't really actually want a book like this because it seems like it's going to be annoying to read it like this, but again, can't find too much of his stuff used, so whenever I find it, I try to pick it up. So Philip K. Dick is definitely on the horizon for me as well. Mentioned how in a previous episode or two how ancient philosophy, I'm going to be teaching a course on that here coming up, so I'm preparing for that by going back and revisiting some ancient philosophy in this anthology here. And then the last thing I'll mention before I let you go is that I do have a lot of props here. I picked up when I went to the library some audiobooks by Stephen King. This one's a collection of short stories. I think it's Everything is Eventual, and then The Stand and It. So I have actually am in the process of listening to It during my workouts. So I'm going to be tackling that through the audiobook, I think. Still working on the Harry Potter series. I'm going to do my best not to completely abandon it. We will see. But anyway, that's it for, I don't even know where this book ended up. I have so many props here and so many other books. But that's it for the episode 10 on writing, a memoir of the craft by Stephen King. Again, what do I think of it? I think it's great. Definitely an A. Again, what was it? Fourth book to reach the Book Musings Hall of Fame. Solid A. Go out and check it out. Definitely highly recommend it. Thanks for tuning in.